Moving right on to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. Two primary concepts covered in this chapter are price controls, and there are two types of price controls. And then the second concept is are taxes and how they affect the market. And so things we should be able to address. What are price ceilings and what are price floors? These are the two types of price controls. When I say price control, I literally mean someone is trying to control the prices in the market. Who is that someone? It is the government. And then we'll give some examples of each. And then how do price ceilings and price floors affect market outcomes? How do taxes affect market outcomes? And how do these effects depend on whether the tax is imposed on the buyer or the seller? You're going to be surprised, I'll tell you right now, that it actually does not matter. It does not matter who you tax. So a politician can say, well, we should tax buyers in the market. And another politician can say, well, we should tax sellers in the market. And I'm here to tell you that it does not matter who you tax. The market doesn't care what the politician says. The tax is going to fall the way the tax falls. And so you'll see what I mean in a bit. To be honest, of the two things, these are again concepts of price floors and price ceilings known as price controls. So between price controls and taxation, taxation is the harder of the two. In fact, price controls, we've kind of already seen this when we covered shortages and surpluses in chapter 4. So that's why price controls are easier, and also because just taxes are a bit tougher. All right, so let's see. Then we'll get into a concept known as tax incidence, and that's basically describing how the burden of a tax is carried between buyers, or how it's shared between buyers and sellers. And then we'll get into what determines this burden of the tax, how it's carried between the two sides of the market. All right, so price controls, as I said, there are two types. So by the way, remember that the title is Supply, Demand, and Government Policies. So this is when the government's getting involved in the market. Okay. One way it can get involved is that it can try to control prices. Okay. One type of price control is when it tries to put a cap on prices. So remember supply and demand. So get your arms out, put them in front of you, and make an X. And where your arms intersect, that is market equilibrium. It is assuming we get there if the government does not intervene. The market can typically almost always get there on its own. If the government, and we'll talk about when it can't get there on its own later, way, way, way down the line. For now, we're going to say, suppose under normal conditions it can, and the government comes in, and instead of that price being where your arms are intersecting, where supply and demand is intersecting, then they're taking the price down. They're dropping it. They're forcing it to go down. They're saying that P star, that equilibrium price, is too high. We, the government, say it must be lower. We will cap this price, and this is called a price ceiling. So a price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price of a good or a service. The other type of price control is instead of dropping the price, the government can say, no, 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 no. That equilibrium price is too low. It needs to be higher. So they jack the price up. So what that ends up being is what we call a price floor. And the definition is a legal minimum on the price of a good or a service. Notice that for the price floor, they took the price up. And for the price ceiling, they took the price down. Warning. You're going to be tempted to do the opposite. Okay? And I'll cover why you'll be tempted to do that in a bit. And it's just because of those words. But think about the ceiling. The ceiling above your head, you cannot go above it. It is a cap on you, right? And the floor beneath your feet, you cannot go beneath it, right? You can't go below it. So it is a minimum, right? It is the lowest you can go, because you can't go underneath the floor. And so look at the definition of a price floor, a legal minimum on the price of a good or a service. Look at the definition of a price ceiling, a legal maximum on the price of a good or a service. We'll model each of these. Taxes are also a type of price distortion. So the government's getting involved and either taking the price up or taking the price down with price controls, but with taxation, they are also distorting prices. Think about it. If you didn't have to pay taxes, You would have paid less for the shirt on your back or less for the meal that you bought. You know, if you went and bought some groceries, let's say. Actually, groceries in the state of California, if they're not serviced, there's no tax on them. But if someone prepared the food for you, like at Subway, then it is taxed. So you would have paid less for that Subway sandwich had there been no taxes, right? So it is a price distortion. It's changing prices and therefore it's changing incentives in the market. So think of it that way. Okay, so both of these we'll look at with this lens of supply and demand. Think of supply and demand as a pair of goggles. Okay, I'm handing you a pair of goggles and I'm teaching you how to look at the world via the market system. Okay, so we're going to put these goggles on right now and then we're going to start seeing a little bit more, kind of like have x-ray vision, seeing a little bit in more depth the implications of price distortions when the government gets involved in the market and what it does to the market. Okay, so first example, market for apartments. Okay, so let's pretend it's you folks here in Santa Barbara. And we have price of the apartments, quantity. And so we would have to hold this fixed. Maybe we could say, you know, 1-bedroom apartment, because obviously the price of a 1-bedroom apartment versus a 3-bedroom apartment, they're different prices. So let's be very specific in our market. And the price of the apartments would be the rental price, right? And then the quantity of units being offered. So we have our negatively sloped demand curve, which makes absolute sense, and we know why it's negatively sloped already. We have our positively sloped supply curve and equilibrium. There it is. Boom. $800. I wish. Well, no, maybe. Maybe for renting a room in a 2-bedroom apartment, perhaps. At least where we live, where I live in Santa Barbara. Most of you do live here as well. Anyway, here's our example. The rate for these particular apartments, it's $800 per unit or per room, let's say. And in equilibrium, there are 300 units being provided. The government comes in and imposes a price ceiling. Remember, I told you that you're going to be tempted to put that price ceiling above the equilibrium price. So let's start there. Okay, let's say the government comes in and says, oh, yeah, we're going to put a price cap of $1,000 on apartments. Okay, that's fine, but the market's already below that cap, government. You wasted your time. Why did you even meet to establish this policy? You wasted your time because the market's already satisfying your law, your condition. So this type of price ceiling, when the price ceiling is above P star or equilibrium price, that is what we call a non-binding price ceiling. It is non-binding, meaning it has no impact on the market. The market outcome still ends up being here at $800, 300 units. Okay, so non-binding, has no impact on the market. But if instead the government, gets together and they decide, hey, we're going to cap prices at a price below market equilibrium, say $500 per unit, then it will have an impact on the market. Again, a price ceiling, if it has an impact, it's going to be below market equilibrium. Why? Because it's a ceiling, it's a cap, right? Think of you standing down here. You put a little stick figure down here. You're looking up, there's the ceiling, you can't go above it, right? It's a price cap. And this will impact the market because it is now illegal to charge $800. So units must be priced at $500. If they are priced at $500, then according to the law of supply, suppliers are going to go, whoop, nope, don't want to provide as many, right? I'd rather move into my unit. I'd rather sell my unit or convert it into a condo or turn it into a parking lot, right? And so the quantity supplied of units would go down to here because that's where that price ceiling crashes into the supply curve. So here's your quantity supplied. And at $500, the demanders, the quantity demanded used to be here, but quantity demanded is going to be like, oh, hey, look, right? Apartments are cheaper. I'm moving out of my parents' house. I'm leaving my husband. I'm leaving my wife. I'm moving out of my, I hope that made you laugh. It's sad, but it's true. Markets and market conditions do keep people in crappy relationships. So if the price drops, right, then quantity demanded is going to increase. I'm going to move out and not share an apartment anymore. Maybe I'll go move in on my own or move out of my parents' house. And so quantity demanded goes up. So we end up having quantity demanded being greater than quantity supplied, right? Here's quantity supplied. Again, take the $500, crash into the supply curve. Here's quantity supplied of 250 units. Take that $500 and go crash into the demand curve at a particular price. The quantity demanded, according to the demand curve, is 400 units. So 400 units are desired at 500 bucks, but only 250 units are provided at 500 bucks. Therefore, we have a shortage, right? A shortage of 150 units in this case. So this is what we call a binding constraint or a binding price ceiling. Binding meaning it has an impact on the market. It changes behavior. Okay. And so it's no longer 800, 300, right? It's now 500 with quantity supplied of 250 and quantity demanded of 400, meaning a shortage of 150 units. Whenever we say the word shortage, remember it means that quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. If supply were to shift, the whole curve were to shift to the left, that is not a shortage. Not in this classroom, not when you're speaking to an economist. Maybe when you're talking to a journalist, because they mess that up all the time. A shortage, by technical definition, means more is desired than is provided in the market. If supply were to shift out here instead, forget the binding price control. If supply were here and we get our new equilibrium right there, pretend there's a supply curve here, that the market is still clearing. There is no shortage. That is not the definition of a shortage. Okay, shortage means there's a gap right here. Okay, so that's a binding price ceiling. In the long run, remember now we know, we are more sensitive to price changes, right? Because in the long run, we have time to adjust. Both suppliers, builders, right, for example, or landlords, owners, and demanders have more time to adjust, right? We are more sensitive in the long run. Well, look at what happens. The politician imposed rent control on us. Politician is here just for a little while at the city level, and then they go up to the county level, then they go up to the state level, and then maybe to the federal level. They're long gone by the time we kick into our long run. And when we kick into our long run, guess what happens to our shortage? It is even worse. It is even more pronounced, right? Because we become more sensitive in the long run. So most economists, it's not that we don't think housing is a problem, housing prices are a problem. It's that we don't think that price controls on the housing market are the solution. Okay, we say there are better alternatives to that. Some alternatives that do not lead to a shortage like this. This is why, for example, if you know what Section 8 is of housing code, Section 8 is basically for low-income folks who need housing, and they get on a list to try to get subsidized housing. Well, the reason that list is so long is because since that price is lower, of course, there's going to be fewer units being provided to the market. So quantity demanded goes up, quantity supplied goes down, and there ends up being a shortage. In fact, in some regions, in most regions, especially in California, it takes years to get called off of that list to be offered a unit, a Section 8 unit. It's not like you can go sign up and then the next day they say, hey, we have a house for you, or we have a Section 8 voucher for you. So, like I said, most economists, it's not that we're pricks or assholes, and we're like, oh, we don't want poor people to pay lower rents. No, that's not it. It's that we know that it leads to a shortage. A better solution would be to relax zoning restrictions, right? Like, for instance, the city of Santa Barbara, or the state of California in general, one of the reasons, the main reason that we have the housing situation that we have with prices being so high is because supply is so low relative to demand. So an economist generally would say, you want to fix this problem? Increase the supply. Allow the laws, make them conducive to let builders build more homes. But what happens? You get homeowners, and homeowners are like, no, don't build more homes. We vote no. Why? Because you build more homes, there's more supply, property values drop. And homeowners, of course, are going to be ticked, right? Well, you are saying you want to fix the housing crisis. We're telling you how to do it. Yeah, your homeowners are going to be ticked, and you're telling me you want to help the poor. Do you really want to do that? Right? So again, societal preferences, right? Social preferences. And that's not something that an economist in a classroom has much to say about. We're here to teach you the consequences of these things. And then after knowing this information, then you go. And now that you're informed, then you'll go and vote, right? You know, and then if you're okay with the shortage, okay, then you know the consequences of capping prices on homes. okay, know the consequences, go vote. Right? It's up to you, but my job is to inform you about the consequences of such policies. Let's go on to price floors. And so the market we'll use for that is the market for unskilled labor. Unskilled meaning low skilled labor. And so it's still P and Q. Okay, so it's still price and quantity. So, but the price of labor is the wage that people get paid, right? So that's why we have W there. Wage paid to unskilled laborers. And the quantity, we're just going to say, well, the quantity of labor. So again, it's still fundamentally price and quantity, except since we're looking at the labor market, we're like, well, let's be specific. It's the labor market. Call a price what it's called. It's called the wage. Call the quantity of labor what it's called. It's called labor. Okay, so still fundamentally P and Q. We've got our negatively sloped demand curve for labor. Think about that. This is a demand curve for labor. Who are the demanders of labor? The workers or the firms? The demanders of labor are the firms. And it should make sense that it's negatively sloped because the higher the wage, the fewer units they want to employ, right? Because labor is more expensive, so the law of demand kicks in. So if we're here at this wage, here's quantity demanded of labor hours, say, at this wage. And if the wage goes up, their quantity demanded is going to go down. That should make sense. It's more expensive to hire workers. They're going to employ fewer workers. So that's the demand for labor. Here's the supply of labor. The supply of labor are the workers, the households, the people. And the supply curve is positively sloped. That should also make sense. Right? At low wages, only this many hours would be employed. At higher wages, you're going to have more people getting off the couch and saying, oop, getting off the couch, going to go work. We're going to walk away from my fun time surfing. We're going to walk away from my video games. We're going to walk away from my child, right? You might. This is a sick and twisted way. Okay, so economics is very much known as being a dismal science, right? And I always like to say that economics can be very sick and twisted. And here's an example of that. You might say, if we have a parent out there, maybe it's a mom or a dad, and they might say, oh, the time that I spend with my children, it's priceless. And you say that to an economist is like, wanna bet? Watch me price this. And so let's say you're a stay-at-home parent, or maybe it's not even parenting, maybe it's surfing. Oh, I value surfing so much, I'm never gonna stop surfing, and you can't pay me enough to walk away from surfing. And I'm gonna be like, hold my beer, right? Like, wanna bet? Watch me. So I offer you $10, or I offer the parent $10. Come with me for an hour. And maybe you are the parent that you guys say, no, forget it. It's not worth it. I'd rather continue doing what I'm doing. And I'm like, okay, here's $20. And you look at me, you're like, yeah, no, still not going to do it. $30. Yeah, maybe not, still not going to do it. 40, 50, 60, 100, 300, 400. At some point, honey, you are walking away from whatever you're doing and you are coming with me. So again, sick and twisted. Right? But we found a way to value something. And of course, it has to do with opportunity cost. It has to do with being able to provide for your child, or it has to do with how much you really are enjoying that surfing and the need to also pay your rent, right? So all of those things come into play, yet we still found a way to value that time, right? I told you, sick and twisted, but useful. Okay, so supply of labor, positively sloped. Okay, that should make sense. Higher wages means more hours that people want to offer. And I don't know if you've noticed, but for the labor market, which is what we have modeled here, that the role of the household and the firm switches. For all other goods and services, it's the firm that's the supplier. But for labor, it's the household that's the supplier. For all other goods and services, it's the household that's the demander. But for labor, it's the firm that's the demander, right? So this is one of the reasons why the labor market is so special, because those roles switch between the household and the firm. All right, so in equilibrium, let's say this is the equilibrium wage, $6 and 500 units. And along comes the government, and the government says, we're going to impose a price floor, and we're going to put it beneath market equilibrium. Remember what a price floor is. It's a minimum legal price below which the good or the service cannot be exchanged. And so the government is saying labor cannot be exchanged for less than $5 an hour. The market is making like a crazy face and saying, oh, wait a minute, government. We're already satisfying that law. You, government, are saying we can't pay less than $5. We're already paying above that. Why did you waste your time imposing this policy? This is a non-binding price floor. So again, warning, you're going to want to put a binding price floor down here because it is physically below equilibrium. And you're like, well, the floor is always beneath us. And I'm going to say, wrong. That it would be non-binding because of the definition, a minimum legal price below which a good or a service cannot be sold. So if it's binding, it actually has to be above equilibrium price. Think of the government imposing this minimum wage. By the way, this is the federal minimum wage, $7.25 as of this recording, and it has been there for years. $7.25, and the government says you can't exchange labor for anything less than $6 an hour. And the wage wants to come down. It's just illegal to go beneath here. Right? So this is, again, the minimum legal price. And so at this price, $7.25, do what we did before. Go to the supply curve, go to the demand curve, identify quantity supplied and identify quantity demanded. When you take that $7.25 and crash into the demand curve, you get quantity demanded of labor. The firms want to employ 400 workers. The workers, there's 550 of them that want to work now. Right? Before they were here, but with the higher wage, they're like, whoop, whoop, walking away from surfing, walking away from my kid, walking away from playing video games. Okay? So quantity demanded goes up. And the firms are like, ooh, too expensive, backing up. I'm not going to employ as many. Right? So I'm trying to show like them jumping. Zoop, 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 zoop. Anyway, so we end up having a surplus of labor. And there is a name for this. If there is a surplus in labor, more is provided, quantity supplied, than is desired to employ, that is called unemployment. So, minimum wages, ladies and gentlemen, do lead to unemployment. Okay? They lead to a surplus in labor, which is unemployment. Okay? That being, so there we go. I wrote it there. Minimum wages do not affect high-skilled labor markets because high-skilled labor markets, $7.25 for high-skilled labor, the supply and demand curves for high-skilled labor are up here. The wage is higher. So $7.25, for example, someone like me, that is below my equilibrium wage. So to someone like me in my type of labor market, that is non-binding. It's a non-binding price floor, right? Because the intersection of the supply and demand curve in the labor market that I'm in is above the $7.25. Okay, so minimum wages only have an impact on low-skilled labor markets, and not on high-skilled labor markets. So they'll affect teen workers, obviously, because they usually have very little skills. I mean, you can't blame them. They're young, right? It takes a while to accumulate them and also to get educated. And studies show that an increase in the minimum wage raises teen unemployment by 1 to 3%. But this is teen unemployment. People who are older with more skills and more education doesn't tend to impact them that much. This being said, let me show you something. Let me use my tablet. Okay, we just looked at both price ceilings and price floors. For the price ceiling, we used the example of rent control. And for price floors, we use the example of minimum wages. And so let me expand on the unemployment that we can observe when we impose a minimum wage on the labor market. And so the way it was drawn in the slide, so remember it's P and Q because it is the labor market. We're going to be specific as to what we call P, which is the wage. And since we're talking about quantity of labor, we might as well just say L for labor hours. Okay. And so this is the labor market. In particular, it's the unskilled labor market, as we said before, because minimum wages do not impact skilled labor. right? Because skilled labor, if it's skilled, here's W, here's L, and let's say it's, I don't know, $40 an hour, and that minimum wage is $7.25. It's non-binding. It's a non-binding price floor in the skilled labor market. Okay, so it only has an impact. Minimum wages only have an impact on the low skilled labor markets. And so we have the demand for labor, as we've been saying, it's negatively sloped. And the supply of labor, and in our example, the equilibrium wage was $6 a pop, or $6 an hour. Well, they came in and they imposed a price floor, a binding price floor at $7.25. And then we saw, okay, at $7.25, this would be the quantity demanded, which I forgot what number was on the slides, and this is the quantity supplied. So we have that quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied. So we have a surplus of labor, right, which we say is what we call unemployment. More workers than there are jobs out there, essentially, or hours of jobs to employ those worker hours. And so right here, it seems like unemployment is ginormous, right? Like it's huge. Oh my God, and minimum wages lead to this enormous amount of unemployment. Ladies and gentlemen, do not fall for what is I like to call visualization bias. Okay, the reason they're drawn the way they're drawn, relatively flat curves, is because it helps us get the point across. Hey, minimum wages lead to unemployment. It's a surplus of labor, da da da. But if you go out into the real world and you look at the data empirically, whenever you hear me or anyone use the word empirically or empirical or empirics, we're talking about real world data rather than just theory. This is theory. Okay, but when we go and look at the data, those curves are actually not that flat. Those curves are actually much steeper. So let's say here's the $6 and here's the $7.25. $25. And so notice that the unemployment is actually small. And the steeper the curves are, the smaller that unemployment's going to be, right? If I get rid of, oops, I got rid of too much. That's what I get for trying to do everything at once. They're the terribly drawn curves, but who cares? And I did a terrible job of drawing this, so this is a mistake. And so I don't make mistakes. I only create teachable moments. And so you should be able to see right now in what I just did that this doesn't make any sense, other than this having to be a 25. But this doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to pause to see if you can think about it and figure out why this doesn't make any sense, but I just drew on the right when I'm trying to show that minimum wages lead to unemployment. The reason it doesn't make any sense is because it shouldn't be intersecting here, right? I should make sure if the wage is $6, I needed to make sure that that demand curve is crossing right here, right at the $6 mark. So there it is. So the steeper supply and demand are, again, no mistakes, only teachable moments. The reason there's less unemployment is because these curves are much steeper, right? Look, in this case, it's tiny, that unemployment right there. And empirically, when we go out there and look at the real world is more like this than like this. Okay? It's more like the case on the right, meaning supply and demand of labor, especially supply, is pretty inelastic, much more inelastic than these curves on the left. And remember what we learned in chapter 5, that the more inelastic the curves, the steeper they are. Okay? So, yes, minimum wages lead to unemployment. However, it is not huge. Empirically, we have found that it's actually pretty small. And so know that, right? It's important to know that, right? Because some people might use this and say like, oh no, minimum wages just do harm and all those economists. So that's one thing they can say. So you can walk out of this class saying minimum wages just do harm, so no to minimum wages. Or you can walk out of this class and say, well, fucking economists. Yes, I'm cursing. Deal with it. We're in college. Those economists, they don't care about poor people. And they're like, don't put minimum wages in place because it leads to unemployment. No, 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 no. That's not what I'm saying at all. That is not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying neither one of those things, in fact. I am simply saying know what it does in the market, but then also know of the true size of the impact. And then with this information, then you go out there and you go vote. I am not here to tell you how to vote, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not. I'm here to tell you how things work. And then you combine that information and your beliefs, not your beliefs, your preferences for the world, combine that and then you go vote. Right? I'm not here to try to change your mind about anything. I'm simply trying to help you become a more informed citizen. Okay. Okay. All right. So that is basically the end of what I'll be covering on this particular video lecture on price controls. But you are definitely responsible for reading everything about them, because the textbook gets into, what are the results of when there's price ceilings, and how that can lead to discrimination, and it can lead to black markets, and it can lead to blah blah blah, long lines at the pump, when there's shortages and you have to ration some other way. That's your responsibility, because you're supposed to be reading the chapter. Now we're going to move on to taxation. So taxation, taxes. This is another form of a price distortion. The government coming in and changing prices. And remember, prices are incentives. As a buyer, the higher the price, the less incentivized you are to buy it. The lower the price, the more incentivized you are to buy it. And as a seller, it's the law of supply, right? The higher the price, the more units you want to provide to the market. The lower the price of what you're selling, the fewer units you want to provide to the market, right? So think of prices basically as incentives, right? And so the government can come in and place a tax on buyers. Okay, or they can place it on sellers. Let's start one by one, and considering the case where they place the tax on buyers. So I'm going to put that here. I'm going to say tax on, maybe it's a $1 per unit tax on buyers. By the way, I'm not using the slides. I'm going to do it in more general terms here. You can then go to the slides and see an application, an example of, I think I use pizzas there. But here we're just going to do it in general, in very, very general terms. So there's a $1 per unit tax on buyers. By the way, this is also known as an excise tax. Not because it's on buyers, but because it's a per unit tax. Okay, so an excise tax. All right, and so let's start with what we know. We know the market. So here's the quantity, here's the price. And if you want to say that it's something, I don't know, maybe it's the market for Legos. Fine, whatever. There's the demand curve, there's the supply curve, this is old news, and here's equilibrium quantity. We'll call it Q star. And here's equilibrium price, P star, the price that clears the market. That's the little star there. And the government comes in and places a tax on buyers. Remember that the demand curve is essentially a ranking of willingness to pay. Okay? And so, actually, let me take a moment to emphasize that. Just focusing on demand. My claim is that the demand curve reflects willingness to pay. And not just willingness. And the textbook does not emphasize this part. Also ability. Because again, I could be willing to buy a Tesla, but I am not able to buy a Tesla. Okay, willingness and ability to pay. And the demand curve is a ranking of this. Think about it. If we ranked everyone in our classroom, and we're talking about, I don't know, coffee, and we asked everyone, hey, what's the most you're willing to pay for a cup of coffee? We're going to have those people who would get the first few units, those with the high willingness and ability to pay. They'd make up this part. Who would get the next few units? If we like auctioned it off, those with the lower willingness and ability to pay, right? It's not until the price drops that these other people are willing and able to pay. So it's technically a ranking, with the highest being up here and the lowest willingness and ability to pay being down here. So again, that is what the demand curve essentially represents. So with that in mind, if the government comes and says, hey, we're imposing a tax on buyers of $1 per unit, and think about what that does to your willingness to pay for something. The total valuation that you place on the good, that's your willingness to pay, right? Does that fundamentally change? Does it matter who you pay? Will paying the government change the value that you place on the good? No, absolutely not. It does not change it. It will change if you had to pay the tax directly to the government and then the rest to the seller, then it'll change what you would be willing to give directly to the seller. But your total amount shouldn't change. If you value your car at $1,000, you don't care who gets the $1,000. That's what you value the car at, $1,000. Whether part of it is a tax or part of it isn't. That's the most you're willing and able to pay for something. So when you tax buyers, what it does is for each unit, it drops their effective willingness and ability to pay. So for example, for this unit here, someone is willing and able to pay this much. It's going to drop by the amount of the tax, by that dollar. Right? This is the T for tax. And whoever, for this unit here, that was the previous one was this unit. For now the unit on the right, someone values it at this much, and their willingness and ability to pay directly to the seller now would drop, right? Again, by the amount of the tax everywhere. And so fundamentally what that does is it shifts the demand curve down. If I could draw a straight line, I tried, by the amount of that tax. Everywhere it goes down by the amount of the tax. And it's a parallel shift because by assumption we're assuming it's a per unit tax. If it were what we call an ad valorem tax, look at those words, ad valorem, based on value. That's what valorem means, value. Then that's more like a sales tax. And a sales tax is a percentage. That's not what we're modeling here. It's not a percentage of the price, 1%, 5%, 8%. It is $1 per unit. So we are not modeling here an ad valorem tax. If it were an ad valorem tax, then it would not be a parallel shift. And to be honest, we don't learn much more if we complicate the graph by making it a non-parallel shift. So we just stick to making it a parallel shift, a per unit tax, because there's not much more insight that we get. In fact, I want to even say there's no more insight that you get other than getting more complicated graphs. So why even do that for an Econ 101 class? Or just get rid of that and just assume that it's a per unit tax and therefore a shift down effectively of the demand curve everywhere by the amount of that tax. So if you want to call this the demand curve with the tax, D-tax, then we'll call it that. And so let me redraw this to get rid of all those arrows to show you which one I care about. Because the arrows are everywhere, right? A dollar drop everywhere. But there's one particular wedge, we call this the tax wedge, that I care about. And that tax wedge is here. This is the one I care about. These are all the same, $1, $1, $1, $1. They're supposed to be at least some, like, you can't draw perfectly. But the one I care about is this one. Okay, and I'll show you how to identify it. I'll tell you how to identify it in a second. So I'm going to redraw this. Again, this is still a tax on buyers. Start with what you know. You know equilibrium. So again, start with what you know. And now the wedge, so let me shift the demand curve down by the amount of that tax. Oops, hold on. There it is. I tried to draw a parallel shift, and I'm going to write D tax. And the wedge I care about is this one. How you identify it so that you don't pick this one, you don't pick that one, you don't pick this one, is you go to the new intersection, and then touch your original curve. Again, go to the new intersection and then go back to the original curve. This is what is known as the tax wedge. And now let me focus on the greater lesson here. So look at what this does. Actually, before we look at what it does, think about what's happening. Before, I kept focusing on, in chapter 4, I said that P star is the price that clears the market, right? It is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, right? That P star. Well, what I hadn't told you is that at P star, the buyer price is equal to the seller price at P star. And what I mean by that is that what the buyer pays is what the seller keeps. They're equal because there was no tax at P star. Again, what the buyer pays is what the seller keeps because, again, there's no tax at P star. But when the government comes in and imposes a tax, that's no longer the case. Think about it. When you go buy, a sandwich, what you pay at Subway, they don't keep all of that. Some of that is a tax. So they have to take in your money, your buyer price, and they set some aside for the government, and then they keep the rest. That is the seller price. The seller price is the amount they get to keep. The buyer price is what you pay. When there's a tax, there's a wedge between those two things. And that wedge is right here in red. What ends up happening is this wedge distorts prices, and now buyers are paying a higher price, and that's identified by where this tax wedge touches the true demand curve. There. And so this ends up being the buyer price. That's what you pay at the counter. They have to turn around and keep the tax wedge set aside for the government, and then the difference they get to keep, they being the firm, they get to keep for themselves, the seller price. Right? So they're not equal anymore. There is a wedge between buyer price and seller price. And in fact, that wedge is the tax, right? The dollar tax. So if you take the seller price and add the tax to it, then it's equal to the buyer price. But if you have the buyer price and you subtract the tax to it, then it's equal to the seller price. Right? They are not, buyer price and seller price are no longer equal. Why? Because the government comes in and distorts incentives with the tax. And so because of that, you'll notice that if you look at our curves, demanders on the true actual demand curve, not the altered one. Demanders are like, whoa, higher prices, quantity demanded goes down. And sellers are like, whoa, we're not keeping PB anymore, we're keeping less. Law of supply kicks in, quantity supplied goes down. So the market does clear. It cleared like it did before. It's just clearing at a lower number. We'll call it QD tax and QS tax. It's clearing at a lower quantity. Why? Because the government discourages trade when they impose a tax. Right? Why? Again, because buyers are paying higher prices. Buyers don't want to buy as much stuff. Sellers are keeping lower prices. Sellers don't want to make as much stuff. So taxes distort incentives, okay, and they alter the market. And this is the result. This is what happens when you tax buyers. Now what we'll look at next is when you tax sellers. Since we're about to show the case of imposing a tax on sellers, let's just be very clear once again that the tax wedge, this red wedge right here, okay, that it creates a wedge between the buyer price and the seller price, and that result will be the same thing when we tax sellers. So let's go ahead and tax sellers. That plot was for a tax on buyers. And now let's say we place a $1 per unit tax on sellers. And the dollar, I really didn't use it. Actually, let me back up here. I really didn't use it. I could have used it. Let's say, so this is again the tax on buyers. Let's say that in equilibrium, this price was, I don't know, making it up, $20. Okay, so that's a 20, 20. And there's a $1 per unit tax. Well, it could have been the case maybe that this went to $20.50 and the buyer price, and then that sellers are now getting to keep only $19.50, right? Recognizing that the difference between the two is the size of the tax, right, from there to there. So again, the buyer is paying a higher price, 50 cents more, and the seller in this example is keeping 50 cents less. So they're both taking a hit. Both the buyer and the seller are absorbing this tax, even though the tax was a $1 per unit tax on buyers, according to the politician, right? Supposedly, according to Mr. or Mrs. Politician, they were placing it on buyers, but the market said, I don't care who you claim to be placing it on. The tax wedge will fall wherever it's going to fall, wherever it fits. It didn't have to be a 50%, 50-50 split. And we'll talk about what determines how they share this tax wedge or this tax, which is what we call the tax incidence, how the burden of the tax is carried between buyers and sellers. And so let's go back to, let's begin now with a per unit tax on sellers. And so we'll start with what we know. We know equilibrium in the market. Some equilibrium quantity, which as you know, I like to call it Q star. And P star in my previous example, I said it was 20. So I'll have it be 20 here as well. And now, when we're taxing sellers, think of the supply curve as the cost of production, reflecting the cost of production. So I'll do a similar little side note here like I did with demand, where we just focus on supply. And supply is basically a ranking of the cost of production. So now you're a seller. You're no longer a buyer. Think of yourself as a seller. And we rank each of you according to your costs. The low cost people on the left, firms, and then a little bit higher to the right, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher, and the highest ones off far to the right of the room. And so if the price is low, only those folks whose cost is covered by the price would provide it. Only this part of the supply curve. So my example would be the people that are ranked in the room on the left, the low cost providers, because from left to right it was low cost all the way to high cost. And then this next set, we start moving to the right of the room a little bit. This next set, higher and higher cost units to produce. And so the people on the furthest side of the room, the right hand side of the room, they won't provide the good to the market until the price at least covers their cost. Because if it does, then they're willing to provide it. Right? Again, if price doesn't cover cost, why would you provide it to the market? So the supply curve fundamentally is a ranking of the cost of production. And so if the government comes in and imposes a tax per unit for each unit produced, like this one right here, that marginal unit, the cost of producing was here, but now it's going to go up by the amount of the tax because each unit is being taxed. And now for this one here, the cost of production is way up here, and the cost is now going to increase by the amount of the tax everywhere. For every unit, the cost is going to increase by the amount of the tax. And I tried to make parallel or same length arrows. I kind of failed, but that's okay. And so now, when I draw my supply curve, it's essentially an upward shift of the supply curve by the amount of the tax. Right here, this right here is the tax. And it increases the cost to producers, so that supply curve is vertically shifting up for each quantity, for each unit. Cost is increasing. You can also think of it as shifting to the left, but it's a vertical distance by the size of the tax. But you can also think of it as shifting to the left. Why? Because an input price technically went up. Yeah, it's not, it's not plastic to make Legos, but it's a tax you have to pay the government. But to make sure you get the right size, make sure it's a vertical shift in this case by the amount of that tax. And you also want to identify the wedge here. The wedge we care about is identified in a similar way, because remember, the wedge is everywhere, right? That tax is the same everywhere. The one we care about is this one right here. Go to your new intersection, your new supply curve and your original demand curve. Go to there, and then go touch your original supply curve. So what I'm going to do is redraw this, clean it up. Let me move this over to the right a little. So again, this is a tax on sellers. By now you're comfortable with all this. And there's my shift. And here's my wedge. Go to my new intersection and then go touch your original curve. There is the tax wedge. And notice that it touches the original curves, both supply and demand. Demand it touches here, which identifies the buyer price, where that tax wedge touches the demand curve. And it happens to touch the supply curve somewhere around there on the original supply curve, and that identifies the supply price or the seller price, same thing. And in our previous example, we said, just to be consistent, we said that the buyer price ended up being 1950. Nope, I'm sorry. 2050. And then the seller price ended up being 1950. And so the gap between the two is the size of the tax. T for tax is equal to $1. And in this case, because it's the same market as before, the tax falls the same way. The distribution of the tax, who carries the burden? In this case, again, 50 cents and 50 cents, or if you want to think of it this way, from 20 to 2050 and from down from 20 to 1950 that the seller gets to keep. They split it evenly just because that's what I happen to draw, but that did not have to be the case. Again, in a bit, we'll get at what determines who carries a bigger burden of the tax. But my point is that you get the same outcome. It does not matter who you tax. And even though here we're claiming to be taxing the seller, the market's like, I don't care what you claim, politician. I am the market, and the wedge will fall where the wedge falls. Last thing I'm going to point out here is that at this price, this buyer price, go crash into the demand curve that identifies quantity demanded. And at this seller price, go crash into the original supply curve, and that identifies quantity supplied. And they happen to be the same, and they will be the same. In other words, the market is clearing. What we make is what will be sold. What people want to buy will be found on the shelves. Let me move it over a little. The market is clearing, in other words, because that one goes over there. The market is clearing. There is no shortage. There is no surplus. The market is clearing. It's just clearing at a lower level. Why? Because the government came in and distorted incentives. At this higher price for buyers are like, nope, not happy about it. So law of demand kicks in. They go down from Q star to QD tax. And sellers are like, keeping a lower price, and they're like, oh, yep, nope, not happy about that. We don't want to provide as many if we're sellers. We're disincentivized from providing it to the market because the price is lower. In other words, the law of supply. So if we combine the two together, you should be able to see right now that it does not matter who you tax. We can get that very same wedge. Pay attention here. Here we go. Q star, P star. That very same wedge, let me just draw the wedge. There it is, the tax wedge, where you have the buyer price here, where it touches the original demand curve, which you pay at the counter, the buyer price, and then the seller price, what the seller gets to keep. He only gets to keep not the buyer price, but the buyer price less that tax. And you can get this wedge either by imposing the tax on buyers, effectively dropping their willingness to pay, or by imposing the tax on sellers, effectively increasing their cost of production. So do you see? You should be able to see now that it does not matter who you tax. The market has the exact same outcome. The size of the tax will determine where that wedge falls. So because it doesn't matter who you tax, economists are like, once we teach that, who cares about those curves? Just get rid of them. Of course, MindTap is going to test you. Hey, you're taxing a buyer. What should happen to the curve? You know, that sort of thing. You're taxing the seller. Which curve shifts? But in the end, what you really need to know, of course, you need to know that also for the exam. But ultimately, outside of this class and moving on, you know, and being a citizen in the world, it's important to know that taxes, they're going to fall the way they fall regardless of what politicians say. Okay? And essentially creating a wedge between demand price, known as buyer price, and the seller price. And then let's not forget that last effect here where we end up getting that. The quantity with the taxes here. Quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. It's just lower. So this is a result of taxation. Now, so if you need to, which you probably do, stop here, rewind, and sit through this again. Or go through the slides since you've already read the book. And the slides give you an example. I think it's pizza, and I think equilibrium price was like $9 or $10. But what I'm going to do now is extend this a little bit. You know how I was saying how the burden of the tax is carried? We can say something about that. And so it depends on elasticity. Okay. So let's talk about taxation and elasticity. So think about it. We have buyers and we have sellers. In other words, we have a supply curve and we have a demand curve. Close your eyes and think about it right now. Which party would have to carry a greater burden? The party, meaning supply or demand, that is more inelastic or more elastic? If prices are or if taxes are a price distortion, it's a trigger. And quantity is going to respond, quantity supplied to quantity demanded. Which curve would respond by more? The curve that is more elastic or the one that is more inelastic? Think about it. Imagine there's a wrench falling right now. Let's say it's you and me standing there in the middle of the room. And out of nowhere, maybe there's no roof. We're in a stadium somewhere. And who knows how, but there are wrenches falling from the ceiling. Totally made up, ridiculous story, but who cares? It'll get a point across. There's a wrench coming. And you are not stuck to the ground. Versus me, I'm kind of stuck to the ground for some reason. My shoes are glued down, or maybe my foot, I don't know, I'm making things up. I can't really move too much. I'm inelastic. I can't respond to this wrench that's coming and is about to fall on us. Who's going to carry the greater burden? Who's going to take the bigger hit? Me, right? You're going to get out of the way and maybe it only hits your foot. But for me, it's going to bonk me on the head because I can't move, right? Because I'm inelastic. You are more elastic. You are more sensitive. When this price distortion comes into place, you're going to be like, peace, I'm out, right? Because you are more sensitive. You are more elastic. You can more easily respond. Versus me, I can't respond as easily. So a good example of this would be, say, the market for insulin, the drug that's needed to control to help people with diabetes control their insulin, right? So their sugar levels. And so those people need it. But the pharmaceutical companies, they don't need to make that drug. They can make some other drug. They can make ibuprofen. They can make EpiPens. They have a patent, but they can make some other drug. They don't have to make this medicine. So the supply side can easily respond, and the demanders can't respond as easily because what are you going to do? What medicine are you going to take to try to keep you alive, right? Yeah, maybe in the short run you'll be like, um, you're not in the short run. You might want to like skip a dose or two, but you're not going to skip too much, right? Why? Because ultimately it's going to impact you quite a bit. And so let me describe that. Let's suppose that is exactly the case. Let's say we're going to draw two markets actually. Here's Q and here's P. And that we have, let me pick the drawing that matches that story. That supply is relatively more elastic than demand. So I need to make sure that the supply curve is flatter. Remember from chapter 5. Relative to demand. It doesn't matter how flat I draw it. What matters is that compared to demand, supply is flatter. And you can do it by using the vertical line test. Right? There's the vertical line. Demand is closer to the vertical line than supply is. So supply is flatter, meaning it's more elastic. And now, if we impose this tax wedge, actually, let me draw equilibrium price first. There it is. And if we impose this tax wedge, there it is, because we know it doesn't matter who you tax. You can tax the sellers. Oh, shoot. Or you can tax the buyers. Doesn't matter who you tax, you get the same outcome. And look at what happens. The buyer price comes way up here. And the seller price drops, but not by a lot. Not by as much. So the burden of the tax is carried more heavily. There's the burden carried by the buyer. They have to pay that much more. Versus the seller only has to absorb this little part. They get to keep only this much less. Right? The seller only has to absorb this smaller part. Why? Because demand relative to supply was more inelastic. They didn't have as much of a choice. They were stuck. Versus if we do it the other way around. So this, by the way, this plot matches the story I just told you about insulin and suppliers, the pharmaceutical company, and the users of insulin. Pharmaceutical companies are likely more elastic than the users. But we can also do it the other way around. Let me move this a little bit to the right. And I took the S with me. That's okay. And so P and Q. P and Q here. Sorry about that. And now I'm going to make sure that the demand curve is relatively more elastic than supply. So in fact, I can even keep the same slope supply curve. I just need to make sure that demand is flatter. Right? Demand is more elastic. So I'm going to do like an extreme case. Right, again, do the vertical line test. There's the vertical line. Supply is closer to the vertical, being the vertical line than demand is. And if you're not convinced, then fine, make demand even flatter. Just to make it fully flat. There you go. So I think now you're convinced demand is more elastic. Okay. Put in the equilibrium price. Put into place that very same tax. The same tax. In fact, I almost want to grab that wedge. Let's see if I can do it. Let's see if I can pull it off. There we go. Oh shoot, I just made it bigger. Hold on, let me undo that. Grab that very same wedge and find it a home. It doesn't belong there, right? Because the wedge doesn't fit perfectly. That's not a dollar wedge, or the tax wedge doesn't fit perfectly. And it can't be here because that wedge is too small for that space. It's got to be like in the perfect spot. Ooh, and I'm close. Ooh, there we go. Close. Close. There we go. Perfect. Okay. By the way, that's the kind of thing you'll be doing on MindTap. And so look at this. On the demand side, I'm going to kind of have to zoom in here so I can write it in. There's the buyer price, PB. I'll shrink this P star. And the seller price, the seller gets to keep proportionally. They absorbed a greater part of the tax than the buyers did. Right? The sellers had to absorb a bigger chunk of that tax. The tax is this whole thing. The sellers absorbed this big chunk of it. They're keeping that much less. And the buyers only had to absorb this little chunk of it. They took a hit, yes, but not as big of a hit, right? Their price is only that little arrow up above P star, versus the sellers are keeping a lot less, right, than they used to. They used to keep P star, and they're taking the biggest hit out of this tax. Why? Because by assumption here, by construction, we made supply more inelastic. Remember, supply is closer to that vertical line, that perfectly inelastic line. And so, what determines how the burden of the tax is carried between, or split or carried between buyers and sellers is elasticity. Which side is relatively more elastic? Which one is relatively more inelastic? And this concept of how the burden of the tax is carried between the two of them is known as tax incidence. Tax incidence. How the burden of a tax is carried between buyers and sellers. Or you can also say how the burden of the tax is shared between buyers and sellers. And remember, one last time, the market does not care what the politician says. It is the market that will decide. It is relative elasticity that will decide. I don't care what the politician says. They can say one thing and the market could just, will, not could, will absolutely be like, whatever, politician. Because the market's the market, right? We can't control supply and demand. They are what they are. All right, so that's taxation in a nutshell, folks. I highly, highly, highly recommend that you go back to the book for any part of this where you're struggling. If you have not read the book, you should be reading the book. You know that. This particular part, taxation, I know for a fact that students struggle with it. So make sure you get it down. All right, moving on to the next chapter. Yeah, see you in chapter 7.